Muy buenas tardes. Good evening. Welcome to the Instituto Cervantes in Manchester. It's a great honor to have all of you, to have Dolores, to have Gideon Long, to pay tribute to the father and the mother of Dolores and the grandfather and the grandmother of Gideon Long, Bessie and Sam, Bessie and Sam Wild, who were very engaged in the Spanish Civil War with the International Brigades. And in that sense, this event is to pay tribute to them, to what they did, the engagement they had with Spain in that very special moment of our history. And also, we would like as an institution to extend a tribute and to thank Manchester for the commitment and the participation in the International Brigades. As you already, most of you already know, Manchester was one of the main groups of international brigades in the United Kingdom and as a whole in Spain. And it's not only that participation that was important, but how the memory and how this involvement has been kept nowadays. There are not so many places worldwide where this presence of the International Brigades is still so alive and so vivid. So in that sense, I thank you again for being here. It's very important for us, for Instituto Cervantes, for Spain. And I thank you again, Manchester, the International Brigades, the families, the friends, and the people who went to fight for freedom. So thank you very much, and I pass the floor to Dolores. Thank you. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much for inviting us. It's a first for a talk from us, and very, very welcome. So thank you. And I'm going to pass I don't even have to pass the mic, to Gideon. So I'm Dolores, Sam and Bessie's daughter, and this is my son, Gideon. So Sam and Bessie's grandson.
So thank you very much to the Cervantes Institute, and we're going to be talking about Sam and Bessie today, my grandparents. I did know them both, but I was only a teenager when they died. And so for the first part of our talk, our conversation, I'm going to defer to my mother, and she's going to talk first of all about Sam in particular and give a little bit of information about his background. So maybe you can start off by talking about Sam's childhood.
Okay. Sam was born in Ardwick in Manchester, and it was a very, very tough upbringing. His mother, Mary McGrail, was Irish. His father, English. They had 3 children. They were working class, and they were extremely poor. Sam's mother died when she was 29, and when Sam was 2 years old. So leaving his father, a single parent with 3 small children to look after. And Sam was 6 when the First World War broke out, and his father left Manchester to fight. So, with their father fighting in the war and their mother dead, the 3 children were split up and sent to live with relatives in Manchester. Relatives who, the last thing they wanted was an extra mouth to feed. Sam's relatives were equally as poor. So, very tough, very unstable upbringing. He went to 14 different schools, left school at 14 with very, very basic education.
And what did he do after school?
After school, he left at 14. He did unskilled labouring jobs around Manchester for a time. And then he joined the Royal Navy at 16. His decision to join the Navy was much more to do with poverty than with a sense of patriotism or national duty. He said, I was fed up with being hungry, so thought I'd better get some to some place where you'd get a regular meal.
Yeah, it's difficult to imagine sometimes Sam in the Navy, but what was his experience? How did he find it?
Well, I think it's fair to say he wasn't a fan of the Navy. He found the differences in living conditions between the officers and the men on the lower decks really hard to deal with. And the strict discipline and what he saw as petty rules and regulations, he found that really difficult. Throughout his life, Sam had kind of an instinctive resentment against hierarchies. The officers expected automatic respect from the men on the lower decks rather than earning their respect. So he was frequently in trouble for insubordination. But there were books on the boats, and he said, for the first time in my life, I started reading, thinking and figuring things out for myself. And he also learnt to box in the Navy and became quite a good boxer. And being in the Navy meant that he travelled widely. He went to Malta, to Egypt, to Brazil, Argentina. And what he saw on those visits angered him. At every port, he saw poverty and dreadful working conditions. As he said, I felt there was something terribly wrong with the world. And in South Africa, the squalor and the poverty that he saw, coupled with his difficulties with officers, led to Sam deserting the Royal Navy. The military police caught up with him in South Africa. He was returned to Plymouth, and after 42 days in jail, he was given a one-way ticket back to Manchester. His 11 years in the Royal Navy were over, and quite honestly, I think the Royal Navy must have been glad to see the back of my dad.
So he's drummed out of the Navy, and what did he do after that?
So he's back in Manchester with, as I say, very poor education, no qualifications. And Sam's sister, Hilda, had met a man called Bert Maysky. And Bert was a Russian Jewish refugee. And Bert and Sam became really good friends. Bert was the more positive, political of the two. And together in Manchester, they got involved in the unemployed workers movement, and really importantly for both of them, the demonstrations against Oswald Mosley's Union of British Fascists, the Black Shirts, and he spent many hours in Stevenson Square in Manchester demonstrating against the Black Shirts. So the beginning of his political education. So that's a picture of Bert with Hilda, my dad's sister, and their son Albert. So when the Spanish Civil War broke out in 1936, Sam and Bert, who'd been fighting fascism on the streets of Manchester, felt that they needed to do the same in Spain. They knew what was happening in Spain, and they felt they had to go. So at the end of 1936, at the age of 28, Sam and Bert left Manchester for Spain. And I've never ceased to be amazed and incredibly impressed by that decision that they made and the other brigaders. I think to leave your family, your job, your country, to volunteer to fight in another country based on your beliefs and your principles and your ideals is an amazing thing to do, and it still astonishes me today. And I often think, what would I have done? Would I have gone? Would I have let my son go? I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Growing up in Manchester, I found out that if anybody knew anything at all about the Spanish Civil War, and many people don't, they'd know something about George Orwell, Laurie Lee, the writer, and the poet Auden. The Spanish Civil War is sometimes known as the Poets' War. But the vast majority of volunteers, not only from this country, but from around the world, who went to Spain were working class men and women. Women went to Spain. Foreign women couldn't fight at the front, but they went as photographers, journalists, nurses. Majadi, a very famous nurse from Manchester, went out to Spain. And I think that that's a really important thing to remember, that these were people, poor people, who left their countries because of what they believed in. And that was the case for the volunteers from around the world. Many, of course, were Jewish because they'd already experienced fascism on the rise in this country. So, Gid. Sam goes off to Spain with Bert, and can you fill in some of the context, the background?
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about Sam and Bert once they got to Spain, but I thought that before I did that, it might be worthwhile just giving a little bit of context and a little bit of history. We obviously don't have time to go into the full history of the Spanish Civil War, and I'm sure a lot of you are pretty well versed in it already, but just a little bit of background. Spain at the time, a very poor country, much poorer than Britain at the time, overwhelmingly rural and very unequal, with a poor rural underclass and a few rich landowners, and a Catholic Church that was very powerful and influential. In 1931, there are elections, municipal elections, and socialist Republican government is elected. They declare a republic. The king, Alfonso XIII, goes into exile. And for the next 5 years, Spain is under the Second Republic. In 1936, there are elections again, and again a left-wing government is elected, and tensions all through this time are rising between left and right, until in 1936, Francisco Franco, a Spanish military officer, leads a coup, which is initially supposed to be a swift coup, but actually is only partially successful. Some of the country supports it, some of the country doesn't, and that's what plunges Spain into civil war. So how does the rest of the world react to this? Well, many countries, Britain, France, the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, and Fascist Italy, sign a non-intervention pact, but almost immediately it falls apart because the Nazis and the Italian fascists supply arms to Franco. Britain and Spain, however, stick to the pact, and they maintain their neutrality and say that they don't want to get involved in the Spanish Civil War. They refuse to sell weapons to the Republic, and that becomes a source of real anger among the Republic and actually among the British Brigaders, who always felt that Britain should have come to the aid of the Spanish Republic. So volunteers start heading to Spain. In total, around 35,000 of them from many different countries around the world during the course of the war. And of those, 2,500 volunteers were from Britain and Ireland, and a big contingent from the northwest and Manchester. So that's a little bit of the context. So to return to Bert and Sam, I'll talk a little bit about how they got to Spain. So the first leg of the journey, fairly straightforward, a bus from Manchester to London. And when they got to London, their first port of call was King Street, Covent Garden, London, which was the headquarters of the British Communist Party, because the Communist Party was organising for the volunteers to go to Spain. Now, I think it's important to say that you didn't have to be a communist to go to Spain and fight in the Civil War. And actually, at this point, Sam was not a communist. He wasn't a member of the Communist Party. And it was only later, in part because of his experiences in Spain, that he joined the party. So they get to London. They have to be interviewed and they have to be vetted at the CP headquarters. And the CP at this time are looking out for various things. First of all, did they have any military experience? In Sam's case, he had his experience in the Navy. Secondly, were they committed to the cause? They didn't want to send people down to Spain who weren't committed. And thirdly, they were on the lookout for potential spies. They wanted to root out any spies who might be trying to infiltrate them. The Communist Party at this time was already infiltrated by MI5. From London, the next leg of their journey took them to Paris. They took the train from Victoria down to Dover. And Bert and Sam and all of the volunteers had to be a little bit careful about this journey, about their intentions, because the MI5 had people posted at Victoria Station and all the southern ports. They were trying to dissuade people from going to Spain because Britain had this policy of being neutral in the Spanish Civil War. So many of the volunteers were rather deceitful about their reasons for going to Spain. They bought return tickets, for example, and then didn't use the return ticket. They told the authorities they were going on holiday to France, they were going for a weekend in Paris, and then they carried on their journey to Spain. So Sam and Bert, on the New Year's Day 1937, took the boat from Dover across to France and headed on down to Paris. Then they were in the hands of the French Communist Party, the French organisers, and Paris at this time had become a real hub for brigaders who were heading down to Spain. They were vetted once again in Paris, and then they carried on their southward journey by train, first of all to Perpignan in the south of France, and from there by truck across the border to Barcelona. They got to Barcelona, so this is early 1937, and this is a city that's in revolutionary fervour at the time. And if any of you have read Orwell's Homage to Catalonia, that's the Barcelona that Bert and Sam would have found. They were in Barcelona just 3 or 4 months before Orwell was there. From Barcelona, they carried on their journey down the Spanish coast to Valencia, which was the seat of the Republican government at the time, and from there on to Albacete. Why Albacete? Well, that was the headquarters of the International Brigades. That's where the International Brigades were billeted. And the British were billeted to a town or a village just north of Albacete called Madrigueras. And that's where they were for these first few weeks. And that's where they had their initial training and initiation before going into battle. So one of the things that Bert and Sam found when they got there was that the equipment was in poor supply. There was very little ammunition and very little training. Only around a third of all of the British volunteers who went down had any experience of warfare, any military experience at all. So little experience, little ammunition, and very few weapons. The lack of weapons was because of the non-intervention pact that we discussed earlier. The British and the French, which would have been the easiest source for the Republic to get weapons from, were refusing to sell arms to the Spanish Republic. And so the brigaders were reliant on old, outdated weapons, 19th century rifles, arms supplied from the Soviet Union as well, and some arms that were smuggled across the border from France as well. But some of the volunteers were pretty scathing about the equipment they were given. This was the view of Jason Gurney, one of the volunteers. He was talking about the French machine guns that they were given. He wasn't particularly complimentary about them. There were other problems that they faced at the base as well. Language was an issue, because most of the brigaders didn't speak any Spanish. Most of the Spaniards they were fighting alongside didn't speak English, and there were other languages thrown in there as well, a big French contingent and contingents from many, many different countries. And some political tensions as well. To give you one example, a lot of the Irish volunteers didn't want to fight alongside the British volunteers. This is just 15 years or so after the Irish War of Independence, and many of them wanted to fight separately or fight alongside the Americans and the Canadians. So there were some tensions there between different groups within the International Brigades. So this is early 1937. Sam and Bert were at Madrigueras for around 6 weeks, and then they were thrown into battle. And the British moved northwest from Albacete towards Madrid to the Valley of Jarama, which is just about 20 miles from Madrid. And that was the scene of their first battle. And the first day, February the 12th, 1937, the first day of the Battle of Jarama for the British, was really one of the bloodiest days that the Brigaders faced in all the time that they were in Spain. I'll tell you a little bit about the reasons for the battle. At the time, Franco's forces had moved up from the south of Spain. They'd reached the edge of Madrid. They were pretty much surrounding and besieging the capital. And Franco's forces were attempting to cut the road from Madrid down to Valencia, which is where the Republican government had decamped to. This is a big battle, the Battle of Jarama. The British battalion played obviously a very significant part in it, but it was a small part in a big battle. If you look at the numbers, the total numbers, there were 30,000 Republican troops against around 25,000 nationalist troops, included German and Moroccan troops. That first day, February the 12th, the British went into battle. 225 approximately of the 600 members of the British battalion were killed on that first day alone, and by the end of the battle, fewer than 100 had escaped unscathed. It really was decimating. But it was successful in the sense that the Republicans managed to halt Franco's advance and stop them cutting the road, but at a terrible price. And Bert Maskey, on his first day of his first battle, was one of those who was killed, and Sam was seriously wounded. Here in Sam's word is what happened to him at the Battle of Jarama on that first day. So from there, Sam was taken to the town of Elba near Alicante to be patched up. I have a photo of him here outside the hospital where he was being treated with nurses and doctors from the hospital. He spent several weeks there, and once he was released, he headed straight back to the front line. So by the summer of 1937, the fighting had moved from Jarama onto the other side of Madrid to Brunete. The Republicans still held Madrid, but Franco's forces had surrounded the city, and the Brunete offensive in July and August 1937 was an attempt by the Republicans to break that Francoist stranglehold on Madrid, to break through it. The British battalion by now had been replenished and was back up to about 600 men, with new arrivals arriving all the time from Britain. And now the battalion was fighting as part of the 15th International Brigade, so it was fighting alongside American and Canadian troops and troops from other countries as well. The Brunete offensive took place in July. It was baking hot, and a lack of water was one of the problems that the brigaders faced. They were also being strafed from the air by German planes supplied by Hitler. The International Brigades managed to take some of the villages around Brunete, but after a while they couldn't hold on to them, and after around 3 weeks of fighting, they were forced to withdraw completely. And again, they suffered terrible casualties. Around half of the battalion again was killed at the Battle of Brunete. And Sam was wounded once again, another bullet wound, this time in his thigh. We've got a photo of Sam there with some of his comrades. I'm not sure exactly where this was taken or when during the Spanish Civil War, but I wanted to show it really, partly because it shows you the lack of uniforms that they had. I mean, these were men who were fighting in any clothes they had. And partly to say really that, you know, the brigades, although they were an international brigade, they were always fighting alongside their Spanish comrades. They weren't fighting in isolation. There was a lot of integration with the Spanish Republican Army. So, as I say, Sam was wounded in Brunete, and in the autumn of 1937 he was sent home. He came back to Manchester, spent some time in here. He could have stayed once he left hospital, but he decided that he wanted to go back By this time, the Spanish border with France was closed, and so the only way to get back, you couldn't travel by truck or by train, so he went back, this time walking over the Pyrenees in 1937. By the time Sam got back to Spain, the fighting had moved eastwards. Basically, Franco's troops were starting to gain the upper hand, and they were moving eastwards and pushing the Republicans back towards Catalonia and towards Barcelona. There was a lot of fighting in all sorts of villages and towns in Aragon, in this central area between Madrid and Barcelona. A lot of them centered on what became one of the most emblematic towns of the Spanish Civil War, Belchite, which changed hands several times through the war, with the armies going through the town time and time again, to the point where it was almost completely destroyed. Here's a photograph of Belchite now. It was so badly damaged that at the end of the war, when Franco was in power, Franco decided that it just wasn't worth rebuilding, and built a new town just on the other side of the road from Belchite, which was built by Republican prisoners of war. So, in the winter of 1937-1938, Sam and the British battalion were sent south from Belchite to Teruel for the next big battle. Teruel was under Franco's control, and the Republicans were trying to take it, and they did take it in January 1938, but immediately Franco launched a counterattack, and the British were called in to defend the city. This was one of the worst winters in Spain for many, many years, freezing cold, and there are some amazing archive images of soldiers pushing their machine guns through the snow around Teruel. The temperature fell to kind of minus 15 degrees, and it's thought that more soldiers died from cold in the Battle of Teruel than they did in the fighting. The commander of the British battalion, Bill Alexander, was injured, and it was at this point that Sam, for the first time, was promoted and became commander of the British battalion. Eventually, in February 1938, the Republicans lost Teruel. Franco took it back, and again, the Republicans were forced to withdraw. And the spring of 1938 really is a story of retreats, called the Aragon retreats, as the Republicans were forced further back across Aragon and towards Barcelona. It was a hurried and at times chaotic retreat. All the time they were being attacked from the air by German and Italian planes, and Sam led the British battalion through that retreat towards Barcelona. But before they got to Barcelona, they had one last battle to fight. That's the Battle of the Ebro, which was the longest and the largest battle of the Spanish Civil War. Now, Ebro, got it marked on that map, it's not actually a place, it's a river which runs across northern Spain. It starts in the hills of northern Spain and then runs right across the country and runs out to the Mediterranean, flows out to the Mediterranean. And at this time, the little area north of the river there, where it says Ebro Basin, that was one of the few remaining Republican strongholds in Spain. By now, 3/4 of the country was under Franco's control. But in July of 1938, the Republican army decided to try and push back across the river onto the southern side, onto the southern bank, in one last big push to try and turn the tide of the war. So, late July 1938, the troops, including the British battalion, crossed the Ebro. They crossed on boats and on pontoon bridges, many of them by night. Initially, they had some successes. They caught the nationalist forces by surprise. They took the town of Corbera on the nationalist side of the river, and they tried to take two hills in the area, Hill 481 and Hill 666, but they suffered terrible casualties on those two hills. Of the 55 men who crossed the river, only 150 survived. Once again, Sam was injured, this time with a piece of shrapnel that sliced through his hand, and he was taken to hospital. And the Battle of the Ebro was to be his last action in Spain. The battle itself dragged on for several more months, and it's difficult to imagine what it must have been like for those men under constant aerial bombardment. There's one detail from the historian Anthony Beevor, who's written a lot about the Spanish Civil War, and it really sticks in my mind. He says that the aerial bombardment was so fierce that the Republican soldiers hung pieces of wood around their necks and they bite into them to help them endure the ordeal. In September...
Can I just add a little detail on that? The wives and the girlfriends used to make and decorate those pieces of wood when their husbands or sons were going off to fight. Their girlfriends and wives would give them that piece of wood because they knew that they were going to need it.
So in September 1938, the International Brigades were withdrawn from the Spanish Civil War. The Spanish Prime Minister at the time, Juan Negrín, was backed into a corner, and he hoped that if he agreed to withdraw the International Brigades, the Italians and the Germans would withdraw their troops from Spain. That didn't happen, and the truth was that by this time, really, the war was lost. And for Sam and the British battalion, their time in Spain was drawing to a close. I'm going to hand back to my mum now, and she's going to tell you what happened after that, after the Battle of the Ebro.
So on the 5th of October 1939, after the horrors of the Ebro offensive, it was a horrendous battle. The remaining members of the battalion bid a painful farewell to their Spanish comrades who were returning to the front to fight. My dad presented the battalion banner to the Spanish commander, Captain Cipriano, and 200 Republican soldiers formed lines and sang the Republican national anthem as they set off back to the front. Brigadier Edwin Greening watched the scene through floods of tears. Finally, the now completely Spanish 35th Division formed ranks and marched to the west, back to the Ebro Holocaust, while we foreign volunteers marched in the opposite direction, towards the east. Fred Thomas describes how he sat in a lorry with a friend on the way back to Barcelona. We sat somberly, sadness and joyous relief, making a hash of our emotions. If either of us wondered what had been achieved since we went over that pontoon bridge on the 26th of July, that thought remained unspoken. Despite their bravery, the British battalion was outnumbered and outgunned. Raw courage and a belief in the rightness of their cause could not overcome the superior force of the nationalists. My father said, "I was so confident that the cause of righteousness would prevail. I never felt that we could lose." And Peter Kerrigan, a very good friend of my father's, wrote, "I will never forget when I was told what our casualties were at the Battle of Jarama, but nothing can compare with the end of our battalion at the Ebro. It was the cutting to pieces of our very bravest. It was a tragic and heartbreaking end to their time in Spain." Of course, some brigaders were desperate to return home, but the feelings of defeat and the deep sadness of leaving their Spanish comrades to carry on the fight remained with many of the brigaders throughout their lives. So the brigaders are now on their way back to Barcelona. The brigaders arrived back in Barcelona, and the final farewell parade for all the international brigaders from all the countries that had sent brigaders took place on the 28th of October 1938. And thousands of Spanish people throwing flowers came onto the streets to say farewell to the foreign soldiers and nurses. I had the great privilege of knowing many of the brigaders, and the brigaders who were at that farewell parade never ever forgot it, and it was an incredibly emotional experience for them. And Fred Thomas captured the emotion of the occasion. For an hour and a half we made our way through the streets. I was not the only brigader reduced to tears. We were leaving the fight, but were receiving the heartfelt homage of the Spanish people. And at that farewell parade, Dolores Long, a political leader and MP known as La Pasionaria, and my namesake, made her very moving speech to the brigaders. Beautiful speech. I'm just going to read a little bit of it. Today they are going away. Many of them, thousands of them, remain here, shrouded in the Spanish earth, and all Spaniards will remember them with the deepest feeling. Comrades of the International Brigades, you can go proudly. You are history, you are legend, and we shall not forget you. And when the olive tree of peace puts forth its leaves again, entwined with the laurels of the Spanish Republic's victory, come back. Come back to us. With us, those of you who have no country will find one. Those of you deprived of friendship will find friends. And all of you will find the love, affection, and gratitude of the whole of the Spanish people, who today and in the future will cry out with all their hearts, long live the heroes of the International Brigades. So the brigaders left Spain, and Franco remained in power until 1975. And after Spain, the homecoming. So they're leaving Barcelona. They travel by train through Spain and France, by boat to New Haven, and then by train to Victoria Station in London. Even though their return had only been announced the day before, the news had spread quickly, and a huge crowd of people, including Labour and communist dignitaries and trade unionists, turned out to welcome them back. Bob Cooney, really good friend of my dad's, described the scene. At Sam's command, we formed up behind flags of all the nations whose sons had made Spain's cause their own. Drums and bugles were drowned out by the cheers of the welcoming crowd. It seemed all London was there to welcome us. The line of police, arms interlocked, sweated and strained in a vain effort to hold the crowd back. In the end, the police gave up the struggle, and some of them added their cheers to those of the crowds. My father and Bob Cooney responded to the speeches from the dignitaries, and then they raised their banner and, led by 3 wounded men, the 305 men of the battalion marched together for the last time out of the station and into the world outside. And the next day, the News Chronicle reported, "These men have made history by forming part of the greatest international democratic army the world has ever known. They have inspired the world by their example, and something of this seemed to enter into everyone who was at Victoria last night, and the memory of it will never be eradicated." So I think you're going to ask me about my mum.
Yes. So we want to bring Bessie into the conversation now. So Sam has been to Spain, has come back, and it wasn't too long after he got back to Spain that, he got back to Manchester, that he met Bessie, and you're going to tell us more about your mum.
Yeah. That's my mum. My mum, Bessie Berry, was born in Manchester. She was illegitimate, poor, and like Sam, brought up in really difficult circumstances. But through her job as a secretary at Manchester University, my mum had visited the Soviet Union while she was working as a secretary. She'd never been out of Manchester before, so the first place she goes is the Soviet Union. And that visit politicised my mum. And when she got back to Manchester after that visit, she got very involved in left-wing politics. And so while the Spanish Civil War was going on, Bessie was active in Manchester with the Aid to Spain movement, raising awareness about what was going on in Spain, collecting money for medical supplies, ambulances, and food.
Do you want to talk a little bit about how Sam and Bessie met?
Yeah. Sam returned to Manchester, and Bessie met Sam when he was speaking at a meeting in support of the Spanish Republic in Manchester. When he came back, my dad spent a lot of time going around the country talking about Spain. So they met at a meeting. They got married on the 1st of April in Manchester. It was a double wedding with one of his comrades from Spain. So that's Manchester Registry Office, and my dad's signing the book. So married on the 1st of April, which was the very same day that Franco officially won the Spanish Civil War. And after the wedding, they organised an evening party to raise funds for the Aid to Spain movement. In a speech on leaving Spain, my father said, "We're returning to our respective countries, not for celebrations in our honour, not to rest, but to continue the fight we helped to wage in Spain. The British battalion is prepared to carry on the work begun here to ensure that our 500 comrades who sleep beneath the Spanish soil shall serve as an example to the entire British people in the struggle against fascism. We intend to keep the promise that we made to the Spanish people before we left. We are merely changing the front on which we fight and the weapons that we use. And in different ways, the majority of the volunteers kept that pledge throughout their lives." Thank you very much.
And yeah, I think it's worth saying that both Sam and Bessie remain very involved with the Spanish story even after the Spanish Civil War was over. This is Sam on the right-hand side there in London, marching with the banner to lay this is in 1940, to lay a wreath at the cenotaph in honour of the International Brigades. And here he is giving a speech. We're not quite sure where that is. Maybe Stevenson Squares. If anybody can recognise it, then please do let us know. We think it might be in Manchester, but not quite sure where.
Can I just add that? Yeah, we found out a lot of my dad's activities after he'd been in Spain through looking through the MI5 files in the archives at Kew.
Amazing what they knew about him.
Yeah.
When they went on the British, the International Brigade convoy in January '39.
I think I read it was 1940, but
the convoy?
No, this photograph.
All right.
Okay, let's,
Yeah.
we can sort that out later. Okay, 'cause I'm a bit aware of time.
And yeah, just to kind of fast forward to now really, and to say there are a couple of plaques in Manchester. The one on the right is the plaque in the Central Library in honour of the International Brigades who went to Spain. And the one on the left, it's a house that you know well, Mum.
Yeah, we were brought up in a little council house in Longsight, Birch Hall Lane, and there's a tiny little, quite scruffy council house, and it's got the blue plaque on it. And occasionally I kind of go past and have a look to check that it's still there. And the people who live there is a Bangladeshi family who live there. And the last time I went, they came out and said, "Who is this?" So it was quite nice to be able to tell them the story of Sam.
Sam died in 1983, Bessie died in 1985, and before the end of his life, Sam did give a few media interviews, and in one of them he was asked if he had regrets about going to Spain, if he would have done anything differently, and I've pulled out this quote from that interview. He clearly didn't have any regrets, and I think it's interesting that he saw it as actually educative for himself as well. It was part of his own education.
And he didn't fight in the Second World War. Why?
No, as lots of brigaders didn't fight in the Second World War, most of them wanted to, because they saw it as part of the continuation of the struggle that they'd been in Spain, an extension of the same war against fascism, but many of them were prevented from joining the British troops, including Sam. Some of the brigaders, particularly those that had more military experience, were allowed to fight alongside the British forces in the Second World War, but many of them were seen as subversives and undesirables, and they weren't allowed to fight in the British forces.
Yeah. I remember my dad saying they wouldn't even let me in the Home Guard.
So I want to close, and then we'll go on to questions and answers, but I want to close with a few lines from a poem that was written by Bob Cooney, Scottish brigadier, really was a very close friend of my granddad's in Spain and also afterwards. And he wrote this poem in the 1960s, and in it he looks back at the Civil War, but he also looks forward to a day when Franco is gone. This is in the 1960s when Franco was still in power. He looks forward to the day when Franco is gone and when he can return to a liberated Spain. So I'll just read a little bit of that poem. We will stroll in the Puerta del Sol and the Ramblas of Barcelona. We will cross the Ebro and drink with our friends in Mora, friends who'll be free. We will look at them and at each other, and each of us will think, this is why I came in 36. I went to Spain, and because of that great yesterday, I am part of the greater tomorrow. Thank you.
And I have to say that I know that Sam and Bessie would both be absolutely amazed that there is a group of people on a Wednesday night sitting here listening to their story. They would absolutely not have expected the interest that is still there, really, because it's still their story of all the brigades, I think, and the fight of put up by the Republicans in Spain still inspires people. So, if you've got any questions or comments, very happy to have them.
You talked about women not being allowed internationally, but Spanish women were fighting and stuff, weren't they?
Yes.
Whose decision was that? Was that the Spanish decision? Seems a bit strange because it was all about women being part of the equal struggle.
Yeah, it's as I say, they became nurses, journalists, photographers.
But were they
but they didn't actually fight. Does anybody else know who made that decision that foreign women wouldn't be able to fight?
Well, some did, and there was a Fanny Schroeder, Danish brigadier, who, because they were skilled in artillery, fought throughout the war. She was a commander. But the sort of stereotypical image of women is with light rifles and so on. But that only lasted a very short time. And then went to auxiliary roles. Felicia Brown, the first British person to die in Spain, she did fight with the military.
Did she actually fight? I'll try and find out more about how that decision was made, because it's interesting. And if you looked at any of those pictures earlier on, there were lots of Spanish women.
I always find those pictures of young Spanish women fighting with the trenches. Quite
Yeah.
inspiring.
Yeah. And I don't know if you noticed, but one of the people fighting was for an American brigade who was black, and I think he was the first black commander.
Yeah.
So yeah, and
Spanish black singer.
Paul
Paul
Robeson.
Robeson.
Paul Robeson, that's it.
Yes, yeah, Paul Robeson visited the brigaders in Spain. A memorable visit.
Yeah.
Thinking about the two sides, on the International Brigade, we've got mostly Europeans, but you said, I think, on one of the slides, that on Franco's side, you had the Italians and Germans, of course, but also Moroccans. How were they in?
So the Moroccan troops were effectively mercenaries who came over from North Africa. Franco's forces, Franco was actually based in the Canary Islands, and he launched the coup from North Africa. They came across the Straits of Gibraltar, and they came across with some mercenary troops from Morocco, because Spain has and still has enclaves in North Africa.
And was there much contribution from Spanish speakers in South America?
There were some volunteers from Cuba, Mexico. The Mexican government supported the Spanish Republic. It was one of the few governments that supplied arms. And yeah, a scattering of brigaders from around South America. But the vast majority were from Europe. But as we say, it was over 50 countries. There were brigaders from China. There were, brigaders from so many countries around the world.
And Germany and Italy.
And Germany and Italy, yes. Yeah.
And France. I mean, I think
Yeah,
probably the largest contingent.
French was the biggest contingent.
Yeah.
Perhaps Gideon can explain the crucial role of the Condor Legion in this, particularly bringing the Moroccan troops into Spain, because the Spanish Navy had sided with the Republic and they burned the barrier. So without them, Franco would have never been able to invade from the south.
Yeah, the Condor Legion, which is the German legion of aviation legion, and they carried the troops across from North Africa to Spain. It helped Franco in the initial days of the war. Question at the back.
You mentioned about how quite a lot of the information was from the MI5 files. How easy is it to get?
I'll describe the visit. Gid and I went down, and I went to Kew, National Archives, and I went up to the reception, and I said to the receptionist, I said, we're interested in finding out some information about my dad. And she said, really, it'd be very unusual to have any files on individuals. There's lots of information on groups, but not individuals. So I said, well, just give it a try. And so she kind of rather reluctantly went to a computer and started filling about. And then I could just see her face, and she said, oh, okay, right, go and sit down. And we spent the whole day there. And it was just, I'd never realised it really was useful, because when he came back from Spain, my parents had always said, oh, our phone is being tapped. And that letter has been opened and sealed. And we all, as kids, all used to say, oh, for goodness sake, who's going to be interested in you in the way that you do? And when, you know, there were transcripts of the phone calls that my dad and mum had had. There were letters, there were copies of letters that had been opened. I found a letter that was from Harry Pollitt, the leader of the Communist Party, writing to my dad to congratulate him, and I realised he was congratulating my dad and mum on the birth of me. And that letter had been opened, photocopied, put back in, sent. But it was extraordinary, isn't it, in the amount of information. And they just, when he was speaking around Manchester and Lancashire, he was followed. And some poor so-and-so had to sit in a room in the middle of Middleton on a cold winter's night, listening to a talk, and then they always put at the bottom of the report, at the end of the meeting, a collection was taken, and they made £10, 36 pence, or 10 and 6 pence, and extraordinary amount of trouble and time that MI5 put into following people around.
I think I'm right in saying that the first entry in my granddad's MI5 files was to register that he'd left Britain to go to Spain, right at the start of his journey. So he'd been involved with left-wing politics before that, but it was when he went to Spain that MI5 became interested in him, and they kept that file open on him for 20 years in total because he was involved with politics after the Spanish Civil War as well.
Can I just add, there is a lot of information now declassified from the National Archives that's available online. And I found that date, April the 7th, when Eric Blair came back after fighting in Spain. The document is really tatty. It's really quite an interesting thing to look at. But yeah, it's worthwhile going down there because not everything is online there.
I think there was another question at the front, yeah.
Can we consider the change of narrative here? You said earlier that Britain signed the non-aggression pact, but it's my view, as I've read the Morning Star and I've read books, that the British government supported Franco. I don't think it's been said openly. Maybe people have thought about it. Well, let's consider this. We supplied the aircraft, we supplied the pilot, surreptitiously, to bring Franco from Canary Islands to the Army of Africa. We blockaded the ports with British Navy. We allowed Mussolini to sink our fleet, and not a thing done about it, apart from a few rumblings in the House of Commons. Even up to 1945-46, we were sinking British ships, as the Morning Star reported. And with regards to us supporting fascists, or the fascists in Greece, to quell the, let's call them the freedom fighters who were fighting the Germans, in 1945, we, through Churchill, were supporting the Germans to oust all other aspects, to support the king in Greece, to oust the communists in Greece. So I think we've got to put some cards on the table here. If I'm wrong, fair enough. But what I'm reading is that the British government supported Franco.
Yeah, I think.
It was a non-aggression pact, because our weakness, I'll put it this way, we were playing cricket, right? Well, they were using karate, that's Mussolini and Hitler. So we were playing at it. All right, I'll accept.
I'm going to let Gideon answer it because I'm really, I'm really aware of the time. Okay.
Yeah, no, I think there's no doubt that the British signed the non-aggression pact, and officially they were neutral in the Spanish Civil War, but there's no doubt that they were worried about what was happening in Spain, and they sided with the nationalists. I say.
Thank you, Gideon and Dolores. It's an amazing example for young generations, especially with the rise of the right wing today. So congratulations for spreading the values of peace and democracy. And my question is, the government of the Republic exiled in Mexico, precisely. Was there any kind of I don't know, compensation or help for those brigadiers?
The brigadiers who came back to, like the British brigadiers who came back.
Or would they stay in contact with the exiled government of the Republic, or was there any kind of support, anything? Did your father travel to Mexico?
As far as I know, I don't think they had any dealings with Mexico. I mean, they have, as we got here, the letter which Dolores Ibarruri wrote to my grandfather, and she was the head of the government in exile. But I don't know if they had any kind of close connection with the Mexican or the Spanish government in exile in Mexico.
And I don't know if I'm wrong, that maybe it could be a stigma when he got back to even find an employment here, isn't it?
Yeah, do you know if there was any kind of stigma involved with having been in Spain when they came back? I mean, I think they were certainly seen as subversives or as, as bolshes.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I know it's a cliche, but I think a lot of them didn't talk very much about it. I mean, anybody who's had parents or in the military or First World War, Second World War, they will often say, they never talked about it. And I think that was the case. I always get a bit annoyed when people say, oh, they never talked about it, because I always think, well, actually, we never asked the right questions. We weren't interested enough to ask the questions. And I think a lot of children think that when their parents have gone, why didn't I ask them more? And
I think there's a particular issue with the Spanish Civil War as well, in the sense that it was kind of overshadowed by everything that came afterwards, right, the next 6 years. And so because of that, when people talked about the war, they talked about the Second World War, and the Spanish Civil War, to some extent, became a kind of a forgotten war, even though it was obviously a prelude to World War II.
Dolores, you were named after Dolores.
I was.
Were you, you just talked about kids not being that into, when were you politically aware of what your dad had? Were you young, or did you wait till you were 30?
No, I was very aware, because our family was so different. We were living on this little council estate, but I had a mother who was going to political meetings. We had my dad stood as a candidate in the local elections. We had posters in the window. We had a picture of Stalin and Lenin that people used to throw snowballs at. And I absolutely knew that my family were different. And when I went to school in Moss Side, and, I longed to be called Mary or Anne or Janet, because people used to say, why are you called Dolores? And I said, oh, gosh, do you know anything about the Spanish Civil War? No. So I used to say, oh, well, my dad liked this film star called Dolores Del Rio, said he had a crush on her. But certainly, fortunately, there are books on the Spanish Civil War, but gosh, I can think of a million questions I would have liked to have asked my mum and dad.
I think, in my case as well, I had an interest and I knew about my granddad's involvement, but I was 15 when he died, so I didn't really have the opportunity to talk to him as an adult. And I think a key moment for both of us was 1996, when there was it was the end of the Felipe González government in Spain, and they invited the brigaders, and there were still quite a few of them alive at the time, to go back to Spain and receive honorary citizenship. And they had they organised this huge event, which was in Madrid, it was also in Barcelona, and I think in Albacete as well. lots of brigaders there, lots of relatives of brigaders there, and we went to that event. It was a week-long event, and it was just incredible, an incredible event. I mean, some of the brigaders were going back to Spain for the first time since the war. Some of them were meeting up with guys they'd fought alongside, and they'd not seen them since the Spanish Civil War. It was an incredibly emotional event. And we went round to some of the towns and villages where they'd fought, and Spaniards were kind of coming out and just applauding them in the street, and just saying, thank you for what you did 60 years ago. So that was a real sort of an awakening for me. You know, I'd been interested and knew about my granddad before that, but that's really what got me involved in it. And actually, I'd worked in Spain just 2 years before that. I'd lived in Madrid for a year and worked there as a journalist. And even then, you had to be a bit careful when you were talking to people. I had to think twice before saying, oh yeah, my granddad fought in the Spanish Civil War, because, you know, it was still a bit of a sensitive issue. I think a lot of that has changed in Spain. Still obviously a sensitive issue, but there's obviously much more openness about it in Spain now. But for me, that trip in 1996 was really formative.
I think we probably ought to finish, because we're supposed to be done by 7. If anybody's interested, the International Brigade Memorial Trust is the organisation that keeps alive the memories of the brigaders. And there's a leaflet there. They got a great website, and there's a database of all the British brigaders if people are kind of checking to see where their uncle was in Spain. And the other thing I want to mention is we looked at the plaque in the town hall and in the, Central Library now. It used to be in the town hall. But we're trying to get a memorial for the for the Salford Brigaders. And Barry, who's been behind this, doing all the hard work, and we're hoping that it'll be in Acton Square in Salford. How many brigaders? From
30 up to now, including a nurse who went out there too.
Okay.
From in action. And thank you for that. We're asking, we need £24,600. There's a crowdfunder, and you pay through your trade union or an individual donation too. I've got the details here, Dolores. So if you take one of these leaflets before you leave, we've got about £18,000 at the moment. We're a bit short of that £4,000. So we're on our way. And I've got to say, it's the rank and file and individual donations that have made that in about 14, 15 months. So you've all done very, very well, as well as trade union branches.
I was going to say one more thing as well. Just got one more slide that we forgot. Sam and Bessie, as I say, died in the 1980s, so they did outlive Franco. They never went back to Spain while Franco was in power, but they did go back afterwards. So this is a photograph of the two of them in the late 1970s back in Spain.
Thank you very much indeed.